On a Wednesday morning in early October, with the frost still clinging to the fence posts and the oak trees just beginning to let go of their leaves, Dale Mercer stood at the edge of his salvage yard and stared at a problem that was costing him $3,000 a day. The machine had been there for 11 days. A 1987 Caterpillar 769C rock truck, weighing in at just over 40 tons fully laden, had broken down in the narrowest corridor of his yard, right between the crusher shed and the main sorting rows, and it had not moved since. Its rear axle had collapsed inward on the right side, dropping the frame into the gravel at an angle that made the whole machine look like a wounded dinosaur that had stumbled and given up mid-step. And the truck had folded itself so precisely into that corridor that it blocked every avenue of the yard's most productive section completely. Dale could not get materials to the crusher. He could not get his smaller equipment around it. He could not, for the legal and structural reasons that made a salvage yard function, simply cut the truck apart where it sat. It needed to move, and it needed to move as one piece. Let me tell you about Dale Mercer. Dale was 51 years old, and he had built Mercer Salvage and Recovery into the second largest privately operated yard in the county over the course of 23 years. He drove a truck that cost $80,000 and wore steel-toed boots that cost $400. He was not a vain man in the traditional sense. He did not spend much time thinking about his appearance, but he thought about his operation constantly with the focused, possessive energy of someone who has built a thing from nothing and is acutely aware that it could be taken apart just as quickly. He had 31 employees, 2 certified crane operators on payroll, and a relationship with a heavy equipment rental company in the city that meant he could, in theory, get almost anything moved. He believed in horsepower, he believed in hydraulics, he believed in modern equipment certified to its stated specifications, operated by licensed professionals who carried their credentials in their wallets. What Dale did not believe in, or had never had cause to consider, was the idea that the answer to his problem might be sitting in a barn 12 miles away, built in a year when his grandfather had not yet been born. He had already spent $9,000 trying to solve it. The first attempt had come on day 2, when he had brought in a 60-ton hydraulic sliding wrecker from the rental company. The operator, a man named Vince, who had been doing this work for 17 years, had spent 4 hours rigging the system and then applied full pressure. The 769C had not moved an inch. The wrecker's underlift had simply pushed itself backward across the gravel, tires spinning because the disabled truck had settled into a berm of its own making and the angle of approach was wrong. Let me tell you about the second attempt, day 4. Dale brought in a 65-ton rotator crane mounted on a commercial truck chassis operated by a man named Fitch, who was considered among the best heavy recovery operators in the region. Fitch walked around the 769C for 40 minutes, saying almost nothing, and then laid out a rigging plan that involved 4 anchor points, 2 ground-level winch lines, and the crane's main boom taking the rear corner load. It was an impressive operation to watch. 3 trucks, 7 workers, radio communication between all of them. When the signal was given and all the lines went taut, there was a sound like a low, sustained chord played on some enormous instrument, and for one moment Dale felt certain the truck was about to come free. Then the rearmost shackle pulled clean out of the axle housing it had been bolted to. The chain whipped across the yard and took a section of corrugated iron fence with it. Nobody was hurt, which Dale later acknowledged was more luck than planning. The crane operator declared with professional composure, that the axle housing was too compromised to accept directional loading and that the truck would need to be partially disassembled before any further recovery could be attempted. The estimate for that partial disassembly, just to get it to a state where it could be moved, was over $14,000 and would take 2 weeks. Dale did not sleep well that night. By day 9, he had tried 2 more approaches. A ground anchor system using auger screws driven into the gravel base of the yard, which had been designed to accept pulling forces of up to 90 tons, had been set up by a specialist from the city. The specialist was confident, spoke in precise technical language, and had a tablet computer loaded with soil-loading software that produced diagrams and figures. But the auger anchors had held for approximately 40 seconds before the gravel, which had not been assessed for its depth and composition at the relevant points, had simply released them, the screws spiraling upward out of the ground like a reversed clock spring. On day 10, a colleague of Dale's, who operated a large demolition company, had offered the use of a track-mounted hydraulic pusher designed for building demolition work. The idea was to approach from the far end of the corridor, push the rear of the disabled truck, and slide it forward on its collapsed axle toward the open section of the yard. The pusher had advanced 8 feet into the corridor before its own tracks had become bogged in the soft gravel margin, and it had taken 2 hours and a secondary machine just to extract it. By morning on day 11, Dale Mercer was standing at the edge of the problem, and for the first time in 23 years of running his operation, he had genuinely run out of ideas. It was his foreman, a man named Roland, who had been with the yard for 16 years, and who spoke rarely but usefully, who first mentioned the name. "There's a fellow over in the Kessler Road area," Roland said in the same tone he used to note that they were running low on cutting wheels. "Old guy. His family farmed that land since before the highway went in. People say he has equipment that does things nobody else's equipment can do." Dale looked at his foreman for a long moment. "How old is this equipment?" he asked. Roland considered. "Old enough that people don't know what it is when they see it." Dale almost dismissed it entirely. He had a phone full of contacts, a reputation to maintain, and the instinct of a man who had always solved his own problems with resources he could verify. But he also had a crusher shed sitting idle and 11 days of losses mounting behind him like a debt he hadn't agreed to take on. He told Roland to make the call. The old man arrived the following morning at 7:45. Let me tell you about what arrived at Dale Mercer's gate that Thursday morning, because it is important to understand what Dale saw before you can understand what he felt. The truck that turned off the county road and rolled slowly through the main gate of Mercer Salvage was a 1952 International Harvester L-Series flatbed, painted a green so faded it had become more of a suggestion than a color. It moved at a speed that suggested it was not interested in anyone's schedule. Behind it, came on a low-loader trailer that appeared to be roughly the same vintage as the truck pulling it, sat a machine that Dale Mercer could not immediately identify. It was large, low to the ground, and appeared to be made entirely of cast iron and determination. It had a cable drum on the rear that was approximately the diameter of a dining table. There were no hydraulic lines visible anywhere on it. There was no electronic display, no modern lighting array, no certification plate that Dale could see from where he was standing. What it did have was a small vertical stack at the front that was producing a thin, steady line of pale smoke, which meant that whatever was powering this machine had already been running for some time before it arrived. The truck stopped. The door opened with a sound like a cabinet being closed in an old house. Yash, and the man who climbed down from the cab, was 79 years old, lean in the way that outdoor work makes a person lean, and moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned not to rush, because rushing had never once improved an outcome. Let me tell you about Elias Croft. Elias had been born on the Kessler Road property in 1945, the third son of a man who had broken that land with horses before he ever owned a tractor. The Croft family had farmed those same acres for 4 generations, and Elias had watched every one of those generations approach a problem the same way. You looked at it first, you thought about it second, and you acted third. You did not act first and think later, because the land did not forgive impatience and equipment did not either. And he had worked his farm into his late 70s with 2 of his grandchildren helping part-time, and he had never once in his life called a specialist with a tablet computer when something on his property needed moving. He had simply gone to the barn where the machine lived, checked the boiler water, fed the fire, and waited for pressure. He was not a man who complained. He was not a man who drove past a neighbor's problem and felt nothing. He had watched the comings and goings at Mercer Salvage from the county road for 11 days, had seen the crane trucks and the recovery vehicles and the men standing around shaking their heads, and had felt the quiet, patient certainty of someone who recognizes a problem they know how to solve. He had come, as he later explained it, because the machine needed the work as much as the yard did. Dale walked across the gravel to meet him, and his crew followed at a slight distance, the way people follow when they are not sure whether they are about to watch something useful or something embarrassing. "Mercer?" the old man said. "That's right," Dale said. He looked at the machine on the trailer. "That what you're planning to use?" "It is." Dale studied it for a moment. One of his crew, a young equipment operator named Bryce, who had been with the yard for 3 years and who had opinions about most things, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was heading in that direction. Another man, an older hand named Cooper, said something under his breath that made 2 other men smile. Dale himself felt the pull of it. There was something genuinely absurd about the situation, though about the fact that he had spent $9,000 in 11 days on certified modern equipment and was now standing in his own yard looking at a machine that appeared to predate commercial television. "I appreciate you coming out," he said, with the careful politeness of a man trying not to be openly rude. "But I have to be honest with you. We've had 65-ton rated equipment on this problem. We've had specialists. That thing on your trailer—" He paused. "What year is that?" "1931, Elias said. Someone behind Dale laughed outright. He heard it clearly. Elias did not react to the laugh. He looked at the disabled 769C in the corridor, studied it for a long moment, walked perhaps 20 feet to his left to see it from a different angle, then walked back. "What's your pull angle been?" he asked. "Or straight rear on the first attempt, rotator crane on the second, loaded the rear corner, auger anchors with a lateral component on the third." Elias nodded slowly. "And you've been loading the axle housing each time?" "The rigging points were on the axle housing, yes." "That's your problem," Elias said simply. He did not say it with any satisfaction. He said it the way a person states a fact about the weather. "You've been loading a compromised component. You need to load the frame rails directly, low and parallel, with a line long enough to keep the pull angle within 4 degrees of horizontal, and you need to do it slowly enough that the gravel has time to compact under the load rather than shear away from it." Dale looked at him. "Modern winching equipment can't maintain that angle from outside the corridor. The geometry doesn't work." "No," Elias agreed. "It doesn't. That's why you need something that can sit inside the corridor with the load, rather than pulling from outside it." He looked at the corridor again, measuring it with his eyes. "My machine will fit, yours won't. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been so certain of your own expertise that the possibility of being wrong hadn't even formed a shape in your mind yet? Not doubt, not uncertainty, just the absolute and unexamined confidence that comes from having been right so many times before that being wrong no longer seems like a realistic category." That is where Dale Mercer was standing that morning, He was a man who had been right about equipment and operations for 23 years. And the confidence that comes from that kind of track record is not arrogance in the way we usually mean the word. It is something quieter and more stubborn than arrogance. It is the assumption that the world will continue to confirm what it has always confirmed, and that an old man with a machine built before the Second World War represents, at most, a brief and harmless entertainment before reality reasserts itself. He told Elias he could try. Let me tell you about the machine on that trailer. The Bucyrus-Erie cable excavator had been manufactured in 1931 at the South Milwaukee plant, in the same year that construction began on the Empire State Building, and the same year that a new Ford cost $630. It had been purchased new by Elias Croft's grandfather, Harlan, who had paid $140 for it, which had represented more than a full year of farm income at the time, and had been considered by several members of the community to be an act of financial lunacy. Harlan had disagreed. He had looked at the land he needed to clear, and the stumps he needed to pull, and the drainage channels he needed to dig, and he had understood that the machine would pay for itself in labor saved within 3 seasons, which it had. The machine had passed to Harlan's son, then to his son after that, and finally to Elias, who had learned to operate it at the age of 14 under his father's instruction. It ran on a steam boiler that had been rebuilt in 1967 and again in 2009, both times using original specification parts sourced from industrial salvage suppliers who still dealt in pre-war iron. And the cable drum at the rear could develop pulling forces that were not rated in horsepower, because horsepower was not the relevant measure. What mattered, as Elias had explained to anyone who asked over the decades, was torque at the drum. The machine developed torque at its cable drum that a modern hydraulic winch could not match at any comparable cable speed, because it was geared for work rather than speed, and because the steam power delivery was smooth and continuous in a way that hydraulic systems, with their pressure spikes and valve chatter, simply were not. It had pulled stumps that no other equipment in the county would touch. It had recovered a combiner's harvester from a creek bed in 1971. It had moved a grain silo 18 feet in 1988 when a barn expansion had required it. It sat in the Croft barn for most of each year. Theo and Elias maintained it the way his father had maintained it and his grandfather before that, which was to say completely and without compromise. Every bearing was greased on a schedule, every seam on the boiler was inspected annually. The cable itself, a 2-inch steel wire rope that had been replaced in 1994 and showed no wear that concerned Elias, was re-spooled and inspected every spring. It did not look impressive. It looked like something that belonged in a museum, or perhaps in a photograph taken by someone documenting the end of an era. What it was underneath the rust-colored iron skin and the patient exhalation of steam from its small stack was a machine that had been built to a philosophy that no longer existed in the equipment industry. The philosophy that a thing which cannot be hurried should not be hurried, and that patience applied through sufficient mechanical advantage will move anything that can be moved. Elias Croft unloaded it from the trailer with a calm efficiency that suggested he had done this many hundreds of times. He checked the boiler pressure, added water from a tank mounted on the international truck, fed the firebox from a small coal bin bolted behind the cab, and spent 40 minutes walking the corridor where the 769C sat, studying angles and ground conditions with the focused attention of a surgeon examining a patient. He did not ask for help. He did not consult a phone or a diagram or a computer. He looked at the problem the way his grandfather had taught him to look at problems, as a physical situation with a physical solution, waiting to be seen by someone patient enough to look. But he drove the Bucyrus-Erie off the trailer under its own power, and it moved into the corridor at a walking pace, trailing its cable behind it. The sound it made was unlike any sound Dale's crew had heard from a piece of equipment before. It was a deep, rhythmic exhale, like something breathing rather than running, punctuated by the low mechanical song of old gearing working in concert. It moved without urgency and without apology, and it fit in the corridor with perhaps 14 inches to spare on each side. Dale's crew had stopped talking entirely. Elias positioned the machine approximately 60 feet in front of the disabled truck, facing away from it. He then spent an additional 30 minutes rigging the cable. He did not use the compromised axle housing. He threaded his rigging through the 769C's mainframe rails at 2 points. Using heavy shackles, he had brought in a wooden crate on the flatbed, and he ran a spreader bar between the 2 attachment points to ensure the load was distributed evenly across both rails simultaneously. When he was finished, the geometry of the setup was such that the pulling cable ran almost perfectly horizontal, perhaps 3 degrees of elevation across the entire 60 feet, and the load would be applied directly to the strongest structural members of the disabled truck, rather than to any component that had already been weakened. Dale watched all of this without speaking. He had intended to maintain the attitude of polite skepticism he had started with, the attitude that said he was giving this a fair chance purely because he had nothing left to lose. But as he watched the rigging go in, he found himself doing mental calculations, and the mental calculations were not producing the results he expected. The geometry was right. He could see it was right. The load path was correct in a way that none of his previous attempts had been. The question was not whether the theory was sound, but whether that old machine had the power to execute it. He was about to find out. Let me tell you about the next 12 minutes. Elias climbed onto the Bucyrus Erie and opened the throttle to its working position, which was not the wide-open position, because Elias did not operate at wide open. He operated at the speed at which the work should proceed, and that speed was determined by the work, not by impatience. The cable drum began to turn. The 2-inch wire rope came off the drum in a slow, uneven spiral and ran back through the corridor without a sound beyond the whisper of steel on air. Then it came tight. The sound changed when the cable came tight. The breathing rhythm of the engine deepened, became slower, became something that could be felt in the chest as much as heard. The machine did not lurch, it did not surge, it simply applied force the way water applies force to a bank, continuously, without interruption, without retreat. Dale's crew had gathered at the end of the corridor. Bryce, the young operator, who had laughed that morning, was standing completely still with his arms at his sides. Cooper, the older hand, had taken his cap off without appearing to notice he had done it. Nothing moved for 2 full minutes. The machine continued to breathe. The cable continued to hum. At the gravel under the 769C's collapsed rear corner compacted slowly, visibly, the surface texture changing as the load redistributed. Elias watched the cable angle, watched the frame rails, watched the gravel, and made no adjustments, because no adjustments were needed. He had set the thing up correctly, and now he was letting it work, which is what the machine had been built to do. Then the 769C moved. It was not a dramatic movement. It was perhaps 2 inches, accompanied by a deep, reluctant grinding from the collapsed axle, and a sound from the gravel beneath it that was somewhere between a sigh and a crack. But it moved. The frame rails shifted, the machine rocked slightly on its ruined rear axle, and the position it had held for 11 days changed. Bryce said something that was not quite a word. Cooper put his cap back on and immediately took it off again. Dale Mercer said nothing. He stood at the end of the corridor and watched, and what he felt in that moment was not yet awe, because ore requires a moment of processing, and the processing had not yet occurred. What he felt was the specific, vertiginous sensation of a certainty dissolving. 23 years of knowing how equipment worked and what it could and could not do, and here was something he had categorized as impossible performing the initial movement of becoming possible, and his mind was simply not keeping up. The Bucharest Erie continued to breathe. Elias had not changed anything. 2 more inches, then 4. Then the 769C was moving continuously, slowly, in the direction of the open yard, its collapsed rear corner dragging a shallow furrow in the gravel, but the frame rails holding true to the load path Elias had engineered, the machine coming free of the berm of its own, settling 1 inch at a time. It took 11 minutes from the first movement to the moment the 769C cleared the corridor entrance and came to rest in the open yard where the recovery crew could reach it properly. When it stopped, and when Elias shut down the cable drum and the breathing of the old machine slowed and quieted, there was a silence of perhaps 3 seconds. Then someone in Dale's crew started clapping, and then everyone was clapping, and someone was shouting, and Bryce, the young man who had laughed that morning, had both hands pressed to the top of his head and was shaking it slowly back and forth. See, not in disbelief, but in the particular way that a person shakes their head when they are trying to make room for something that has just changed the dimensions of what they thought was possible. Dale Mercer stood in the open yard with his hands at his sides, and his face had gone a color that was not its usual color. Elias walked down off the Bucyrus Erie, checked the cable tension with his hand, and began the process of releasing the rigging. He did not take a bow. He did not raise his hands. He worked with the same unhurried competence with which he had set everything up, as if the outcome had never been in serious doubt, which, for him, it had not. When the rigging was free, he coiled the cable back to the drum by hand, a process that took several minutes. And when it was done, he climbed onto the machine and drove it back out of the corridor and onto the low-loader trailer. Dale walked over to him while the trailer was being secured. "What do I owe you?" he said. Elias looked at him. "You don't owe me anything today. But if it worked the way you needed it to, there's a small agricultural history society over in Millard County that could use some support. Whatever you think is appropriate." Dale nodded. He tried to say something and found he did not immediately have the words for it. He settled for extending his hand, which Elias shook, and then the old man climbed into the International truck and drove back out through the gate at the same unhurried pace at which he had arrived. The next morning, Dale Mercer drove out to the Kessler Road property. He found Elias in the barn, doing maintenance on the Bucyrus Erie with the focused attention of a craftsman at work on something that mattered. The barn smelled of oil and coal and old iron, and the light came through the gaps in the boards in long, angled columns that lit the machine like something in a painting. Dale apologized. He did it plainly and without dressing it up, because a plain apology is the only kind that costs you what it is supposed to cost you. He said he had been dismissive and he had been wrong, and that he was sorry for the laughter that had come from his crew, some of which he had not stopped when he could have. Elias listened without interruption, and then was quiet for a moment, the way a man is quiet when he is deciding which part of a large answer to give. "The machine doesn't care about the laugh," Elias said finally. "It's been doing this work since before anyone alive today was born. It's heard worse." He set down the wrench he was holding. "The thing people get wrong about old equipment is they think slow means weak. This machine doesn't develop its force quickly, so they assume it doesn't develop much force. But it doesn't need to be quick. The problem it's pulling against isn't going anywhere. The load will wait. The machine is built on that understanding. It was engineered for the reality that some work cannot be rushed, and that the tools you bring to unreasonable work need to be unreasonable in their own right. He picked up the wrench again. Your equipment was faster. It just wasn't stubborn enough. Dale drove to Millard County that afternoon and made a donation to the Agricultural History Society. And he had intended to give $500, which was what he felt the agreement called for. He gave $3,000. He did not announce this to anyone. Let me tell you about the years that followed. The story of what had happened at Mercer Salvage moved through the county the way stories of that kind move, which is to say thoroughly and with elaboration. By the following spring, Elias Croft had been called out twice more for jobs that modern equipment had failed to complete, once for a buried concrete vault on a road project that had resisted 3 days of excavator work, and once for a massive oak stump on a residential property that had defeated a forestry mulcher and a stump grinder in sequence. Both times the result had been the same. Both times the crew watching had gone quiet, and then loud. Elias did not advertise, and he did not have a business. He responded to the calls that reached him through people who knew people, and he made the same offer each time. If it works, give something to the Historical Society. If it doesn't, you've lost nothing but a morning. He was called out 11 times over the next 4 years, and he succeeded 10 of those times. The one failure, he later explained to Dale over coffee at the Kessler Road kitchen table, had been a situation where the load path could not be made to work regardless of the equipment used, because the substrate was simply not capable of providing the reaction force required. He had told the property owner this before he attempted it, had recommended a different approach, and had been overruled by a structural engineer who arrived later and reached the same conclusion after a day of his own attempts. Dale Mercer became a different kind of businessman in the years after that October morning. Not a worse one, not a slower or less effective one, but a man who had learned to ask, before he declared a thing impossible, whether he was measuring impossibility against the limits of the tools he knew or the limits of the problem itself. He told the story to his employees, to contractors he worked with, and eventually to his son Marcus, who joined the business in his mid-20s and who had his father's instinct for efficiency and his father's tendency to trust what was modern and certified over what was old and unverifiable. Elias Croft passed away on a February morning 8 years after the day he had driven through Dale Mercer's gate. He was 87 years old. He had been in the barn the morning before he died, doing maintenance on the Bucyrus Erie, and his granddaughter Lena, who had been helping him with the farm for the past 3 years, had been working alongside him. The funeral was attended by people from 4 counties, including a contingent from the Agricultural History Society in Millard County, who brought a wreath and a framed letter, and including Dale Mercer, who stood in the back of the church and held his hat in both hands throughout the service. Lena Croft was 26 years old when her grandfather died, and she had been learning the machine since she was 12. She knew how to read boiler pressure and what the sound of a governor doing its job was supposed to sound like, and how to splice wire rope to a specification that would have satisfied the original manufacturer. She was not sentimental about the machine in the way that people who do not use things are sentimental about them. She was practical about it, which is a deeper kind of respect. She kept the farm, she kept the machine, she kept the offer. If it works, give something to the Historical Society. And 3 years after Elias was gone, a call came through to the Kessler Road property from a salvage yard on the south side of the county. The man calling was named Marcus Mercer, and he explained the situation with the clipped efficiency of someone who ran a tight operation and was accustomed to solving his own problems. A piece of equipment had become lodged in a corridor of his yard in a way that was costing him money by the day. He had tried multiple recovery approaches, all of which had failed. Someone had given him her number. And Lena Croft listened to the description of the problem, asked 3 questions about the geometry of the corridor and the nature of the damaged frame, and said she would come in the morning. She arrived at 7:45 in a truck that was not a 1952 International, but was still older than anything else in the yard, pulling the same low-loader trailer, carrying the same machine, with its small stack trailing a thin line of pale smoke, because she had fired it up 40 minutes before leaving the farm. Marcus Mercer came out to meet her and stopped walking when he saw the trailer and what was on it. He was his father's son in most of the ways that mattered, and one of the ways it mattered most in this moment was that he had heard the story. He had heard it a dozen times, told by his father at kitchen tables and job sites over the years, told in the particular way that Dale Mercer told it, which was not as a boast, but as a confession, an account of a morning when the assumptions of a lifetime had been corrected by an old man and a machine that predated the Second World War. Marcus did not laugh. He walked out to meet her with his hands at his sides and a look on his face that was not skepticism and was not credulity, but was something older and more useful than either, the look of a man who has been told by someone he trusts that the world is larger than it appears, and who is standing now at the edge of that larger world and simply paying attention. Lena Croft climbed down from the cab, shook his hand, and walked toward the corridor to look at the problem. She walked with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned not to rush. Some things do not become obsolete. They wait, patient as iron, for the moment when the world remembers why they were built,